in the living room was thicker than the papers on the mahogany table. Laura sat motionless on the edge of the cream leather sofa, her fingers tracing the rim of the teacup she hadn't sipped from. Across from her, Curtis stood, not angry or emotional, just cold. "I've signed everything. The lawyer will send you the final notice by Monday," he said, voice void of warmth. His suitcase stood by the door, packed and ready, as if the last 12 years of their marriage were just an extended hotel stay. Laura didn't speak. She couldn't. She'd rehearsed 100 things she might say if this day ever came. But now that it was here, all she could do was stare at the man she once called her future, walking out without even asking if she would be okay. He walked toward the door, paused briefly, and looked back. "It's not like we were going anywhere, Laura. No kids. No spark. I can't keep waiting for something that'll never happen." She felt her lips tremble, but she refused to let them break. "I tried, Curtis," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I wanted it too." But he had already opened the door. Outside, a red convertible waited, and in the passenger seat sat Carol, the girl from the office with the high heels, the bold lipstick, and no history with him. Laura stood and watched as he placed his suitcase in the trunk, gave Carol a brief kiss, and drove away without a single glance back. The sound of the engine faded, but the echo of abandonment filled every corner of the house. She walked to the table, looked at the divorce papers, and saw her signature beside his. A union reduced to ink and legal language. The life they built was gone, and the only thing he left behind was the frozen sperm sample he had once reluctantly agreed to store, at her insistence. She didn't know it then, but that remnant, dismissed, ignored, and legally hers, would one day change everything. The doctor's office smelled faintly of antiseptic and lavender air freshener, a strange combination that made Laura nauseous. She sat stiffly across from Dr. Evans, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. His words were clinical, rehearsed, but the weight of them shattered something inside her. "I'm afraid your chances of natural conception are still extremely low, Laura," he said, gently sliding a folder toward her. "Your AMH levels have declined even more since last year." She tried to nod, tried to hold her dignity in place, but her throat tightened painfully. "Isn't there anything left to try?" she asked, her voice brittle. The doctor sighed, then offered a small, sorrowful smile. "We've exhausted most of the viable options, unless you consider IVF with donor sperm or an existing sample." Later that evening, Laura sat curled up on the sofa, wrapped in a throw blanket that didn't warm her. Margaret arrived with 2 cups of coffee and a bag of pastries, sensing the storm behind Laura's eyes before any words were spoken. "It didn't go well," Laura whispered. "Still no chance, not naturally." Margaret placed the coffee on the table and sat beside her. "What does naturally even mean anymore?" she asked. "You have options, but you have to want it, Laura. Not for revenge, not for Curtis, for you." Laura didn't answer immediately. She stared at the steam rising from the cup, imagining the future she had once dreamed of, little feet running down the hallway, sleepy hugs in the morning. That dream hadn't left her. It had just retreated. "I still want to be a mother," she finally said. Margaret nodded. "Then be one. Just don't wait for anyone to make you believe you're worthy of it." And with that, a small flame of resolve began to flicker deep in Laura's chest. 2 weeks passed before Laura found the courage to make the appointment. The fertility clinic sat quietly between a flower shop and a dry cleaner, its exterior unassuming, yet it held a chapter of her past she wasn't sure she was ready to reopen. She stepped inside and gave her name to the receptionist, who tapped at her keyboard before looking up with a professional smile. "We still have a cryopreserved sample on record from your ex-husband, Mr. Curtis Bennett. Shall I retrieve the file?" Laura hesitated, her heart drumming. "Yes, please." In the private consultation room, a nurse explained the process again. "It's still viable, and it's legally yours. He signed full release of rights before the divorce." The words sounded surreal, like someone narrating a movie about someone else's life. But this was her story now, and the only voice that mattered was the one in her chest saying, "Do it." Later that night, Laura stood in her bathroom, brushing her hair in the mirror, her eyes fixed on the reflection that barely resembled the woman who'd once believed her life ended when Curtis walked away. She opened the bottom drawer of her vanity and pulled out a slim folder the clinic had given her, detailing timelines and procedures. She placed it beside the framed photo of her wedding, still gathering dust behind lotion bottles and perfume. She picked up the photo and stared at the two smiling strangers frozen in time. "You never wanted this," she whispered. "But I did." Without another thought, she slid the picture into a drawer and shut it firmly. It was time to close that chapter, not with tears or screams, but with a decision. Tomorrow, she would begin the IVF process. And this time, she wouldn't ask for permission. She wouldn't need anyone's blessing. What she wanted, what she deserved, was no longer up for debate. Curtis leaned back against the velvet headboard of his hotel suite, swirling whiskey in a short glass as Carol strutted out of the bathroom in a silk robe. She had a way of demanding attention even in silence, her presence loud and calculated. "You're quiet tonight," she said, plopping beside him and taking a sip from his glass. "Thinking about your little ex-wife again?" Curtis chuckled dismissively, but didn't answer. Carol smirked. "She's probably still crying in that big old house. I'd be surprised if she hasn't taken in a stray cat for company." He gave a short laugh, but it lacked conviction. "She's not your concern, Carol," he muttered. "She was never the problem. We just drifted." Carol rolled her eyes. "Don't get sentimental now. You left a barren woman. You did her a favor." As Carol touched up her lipstick in the mirror, Curtis watched her reflection. She was beautiful, objectively so, but she carried an edge, a sharpness Laura never had. "You really think she's not still hoping you'll come back?" Carol asked, adjusting her robe for effect. "You were the best thing that ever happened to her." Curtis shifted uncomfortably. He hated that part of him, wondered if that was true. Carol tossed her hair and walked out of the room. "I told you, baby. Give me a few months, and I'll give you a child. One that actually belongs to you." Alone again, Curtis stood and walked toward the mirror. For a second, he saw something unfamiliar in his own eyes, uncertainty, maybe even guilt. But he shrugged it off and poured another drink. In his mind, Laura was still the same woman she'd always been, quiet, dependent, and empty-handed. And he was still the man who got away, or so he thought. The clinic's consent form felt heavier than any document Laura had ever signed, not because of the words printed on it, but because of what it meant for her life going forward. The moment was intimate, yet incredibly lonely. No one sat beside her. No one waited in the lobby to hold her hand. But the silence didn't hurt the way it used to. Dr. Evans reviewed the procedure schedule, but Laura barely heard him. Her thoughts were elsewhere, on the hope she once buried and the seed she was now choosing to plant without apology. When the pen touched paper, her fingers trembled slightly. "Take your time," the nurse said gently, misreading her hesitation for fear. But Laura wasn't afraid. She was grieving the version of herself that always waited for love to show up and fix her. With a breath, she signed. "We'll begin the hormone prep immediately," the nurse said, sealing the folder. Laura nodded. It was done. Later, she called Rodney, her longtime friend and lawyer, the only person she trusted with the full truth. They met at a quiet rooftop bar, the wind gently combing through her hair as city lights blinked behind them. "You actually went through with it?" he asked, surprised but not judgmental. "I did," Laura replied, sipping her lemonade. "I'm going to be a mother, Rodney. I don't know how or when, but I'm claiming that now." He looked at her for a moment, pride softening his features. "Does Curtis know?" She shook her head, and he never will. Not unless the day calls for it. Rodney leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You're doing this for you, right? Not for closure?" Laura met his gaze without blinking. "I'm doing this because something in me still believes I was meant to love deeper than I've been allowed to." Rodney didn't argue. Instead, he raised his glass. "To the kind of motherhood that doesn't need permission." They clinked drinks, and for the first time in a long time, Laura felt the glow of something that wasn't pain. It was quiet resolve. The day of the embryo transfer arrived wrapped in rain clouds and soft thunder. Laura sat in a pale blue gown on the edge of the hospital bed, her hands resting protectively on her stomach, though there was nothing there yet. A nurse gently entered, offering a reassuring smile. "Are you ready, Ms. Bennett?" Laura nodded, her voice caught in her throat. The medical team moved with quiet precision. "The stirrups," the lights, the long, slender catheter. It was a procedure that took less than 20 minutes, but it felt like stepping off a cliff with no promise of what lay below. She stared at the ceiling, blinking away the blur in her vision, whispering a silent prayer to a future she still couldn't see. "Grow," she murmured under her breath. "Hold on to me. I'm ready now." When it was over, she lay still, her hands never leaving her belly. She didn't cry, but she didn't smile either. Hope wasn't loud. It was buried, waiting. In the recovery lounge, Laura reclined beneath a soft blanket, sipping warm herbal tea. The doctor came in quietly, sitting beside her. "The embryo looked strong," he said gently. "We'll know in a few days if it takes." Laura nodded, too exhausted to ask more questions. Outside, raindrops dotted the clinic windows like a gentle lullaby. As she left with a folder of instructions and hormone prescriptions, she didn't feel victorious, just suspended. Back at home, she passed the nursery room she once began decorating during their second year of marriage, before the tests and the tears. It had become a storage space, but now something pulled her toward it. She opened the door and stepped inside. Dust clung to the corners, but the faint outline of stars on the wall remained. She sat on the floor, her hand brushing against an old stuffed rabbit tucked behind a storage box. It still smelled like lavender and dreams. "If you find me," she whispered into the quiet, "I'll be ready this time." The wind outside howled, but inside her, a new quiet began to form, a shelter made not of certainty, but surrender. The rooftop ballroom glittered with chandeliers and clinking champagne glasses as Curtis soaked in the praise of colleagues and strangers alike. "To the man who never missed a target," one of his partners toasted, raising a glass. Carol clung to his arm in a red satin gown that shimmered beneath the lights, smiling like she owned the night. "I told you this year would be yours," she whispered in his ear, "and I wasn't wrong." Curtis grinned, lifting his glass as guests cheered, but his eyes drifted toward the balcony, where the city spread like a jeweled carpet. Something in him felt out of sync. The music, the lights, the people, it was all perfect. And yet it wasn't. A strange emptiness swirled just behind the applause. Carol took a selfie, pulling him into the frame. "Hashtag power couple," she said. "Your ex is probably watching from that old couch of hers." In truth, Laura wasn't watching, but the photos eventually made their way to her phone via a well-meaning coworker who texted, "Did you see Curtis trending?" She opened the link and stared at the glossy images. Carol's high-slit dress, Curtis's smug grin, the gold banner reading, "Bennett Group, New Era Begins." It didn't sting the way it used to. Not anymore. She closed the link, turned off her phone, and looked out her own window, where rain had given way to a soft moonrise. Her body felt foreign now, wrapped in hormone-induced fatigue, but there was something sacred in her tiredness. "Let them toast," she murmured. "I'm building something they can't take pictures of." She stood, walked to her kitchen, and made tea by herself. There was no applause, no flash, just the sound of water boiling and her heart holding steady beneath it all. Margaret paced Laura's living room, her arms folded as she eyed the untouched breakfast on the table. "You haven't called me back in days, Laura. And you canceled dinner twice," she said, trying to sound casual but failing. Laura emerged from the hallway in an oversized cardigan and socks, her skin pale and her eyes shadowed. "I've just been tired," she replied softly. "Not sick, just tired in a way rest can't fix." Margaret narrowed her eyes, studying her friend's quiet demeanor. "You're hiding something. I know you." Laura gave a small smile, weak but kind. "I'm not ready to explain yet, but I promise I'm not in any danger. I'm doing something important for myself." Margaret sat down slowly, unsure whether to press further. "You've always carried too much alone. Just promise you'll let me be there when the silence gets too loud." Later that evening, Margaret found herself staring at a photo on Laura's bookshelf, one from years ago, where they stood beside each other, arms slung around shoulders, both wearing sun hats on a beach. "You used to laugh more," she said, almost to herself. Laura turned from the window, her voice calm. "Laughter felt expensive for a while, like I had to earn it back." Margaret reached for her hand. "Whatever you're going through, I'm here. And I won't ask again. Just don't disappear." Laura nodded, and something in her softened. It wasn't time yet to tell her everything, but maybe soon. The truth was growing, quiet and unseen, but it would need light eventually. For now, she treasured the peace of being believed, even without all the pieces revealed. Laura sat alone on the edge of her bed, the mid-morning sun trickling in through half-drawn curtains. One hand rested on her stomach, the other clutching the edge of the blanket. The sensation was faint, like a whisper beneath her skin, but it stopped her breath. Then there it was again, a flutter, delicate, rhythmic, alive. Her lips parted as tears blurred her vision. The world stilled. The silence in the room gave way to something larger, movement, life, presence. She gasped softly and whispered to the air, "You're really there." The emotional weight of it crashed over her all at once. For years, she had walked through months filled with waiting rooms, needles, empty calendars. But now, something inside her had chosen to stay. She pressed both hands gently to her belly, sobbing quietly. It wasn't sadness, it was reverence. This wasn't a ghost or a hopeful dream. This was real. She reached for her phone and shakily dialed Rodney. "I felt them," she said as soon as he picked up. "Them?" he asked, confused. "Yes, there's more than one. I knew at the scan. But now I can feel it. I felt them move." Rodney went silent, then said warmly, "You sound different." Lighter, Laura exhaled slowly. "It's the first time I felt like a mother, not just someone hoping to be." She looked around her room, no baby things yet, no signs of preparation. But the change had already happened. It wasn't about furniture or diapers. It was about the sacred reality now forming beneath her heart. She wasn't just going to be a mother. She already was. Curtis scrolled through his phone in bed beside Carol, who was still asleep with her arm flung across him. Her lipstick-stained wine glass from the night before sat half full on the side table. He wasn't searching for anything in particular when he noticed Laura's name pop up in a tagged comment on a mutual friends page. Curious, he clicked it. It was a blurry group photo from a community art event downtown. Laura stood slightly off-center, her hand resting subtly on her stomach. Her smile was calm, reserved, but what unsettled Curtis wasn't her presence, it was her glow. She looked grounded, and she wasn't alone. A man, Rodney, stood beside her, protective and quietly close. Curtis stared at the image, eyes narrowing. He wasn't used to seeing Laura like that, present, not surviving. Later that day, Carol stormed into the kitchen in a silk robe, her voice sharp. "Why did I hear from Ashley that you were looking up your ex-wife's photos?" Curtis set his coffee down. It was one post. She showed up on a feed. I clicked it. That's all. Carol didn't believe him. "You've been weird ever since your party. Don't pretend I haven't noticed. You keep zoning out." Curtis walked past her, brushing her off. "You're imagining things." But he knew something had shifted. Seeing Laura like that, unbothered, radiant, left an odd taste in his mouth. He had come to believe she'd vanish into sadness, that her story ended where he left her. But that photo whispered otherwise. And he didn't like what it suggested, that maybe she had found something, or someone, that made his absence irrelevant. The hospital room was dimly lit, quiet but brimming with tension as Laura gripped the side rail of her bed. Sweat clung to her forehead, and her breath came in short, shallow gasps. The nurse gently wiped her brow, whispering, "Almost there, Laura. You're doing beautifully." With every contraction, Laura thought her body might break open entirely, but something stronger than the pain kept her grounded. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't broken. She was delivering a purpose that had once lived only in her prayers. A sharp cry pierced the air, then another, and another. Her vision blurred as 3 newborn wails filled the room like a choir of victory. "Triplets," the nurse confirmed breathlessly. 3 healthy boys. Laura collapsed against the pillows, tears streaming down her cheeks, as the world inside her finally took its first breath outside. Wrapped in tiny blankets, the babies were brought to her one by one. Each had a distinct softness to his features. But what caught Laura's breath was their eyes, dark, steady, already echoing a resemblance she couldn't ignore. She reached for the nearest one, whispering, "You held on, all of you." Rodney arrived hours later, and when he saw them, his expression shifted from disbelief to awe. "You did this alone," he murmured. Laura shook her head. "Not alone. Quietly. There's a difference." She registered them under her name only. No father listed, no questions asked. The nurses didn't pry, and Rodney didn't push. As she cradled her sons, a silent vow formed in her heart. She would protect their peace, even if it meant guarding them from the past that helped create them. Nighttime was a chaos Laura had never known, feeding rotations every 2 hours, burping cloths piled like laundry mountains, the smell of formula, and the occasional diaper disaster. But through the blur of exhaustion, Laura never once wished it away. She'd sit in the rocking chair, all 3 boys tucked around her in turns, humming songs she hadn't sung in years. The house no longer echoed, it breathed. There was no silence now, only life. The boys were named Julian, Caleb, and Miles. Their personalities began to glimmer even in infancy. Julian cried the loudest, Caleb stared the longest, and Miles clung the hardest. Sometimes, when she held them all against her chest, Laura would close her eyes and whisper, "You are mine, and I am more because of you." Margaret visited one morning and stopped in the doorway, stunned. The living room was scattered with bottles, rattles, and burp cloths, but at the center was Laura, half asleep with 2 babies in her lap and the third in a wrap on her chest. "You look like a battlefield and a blessing," Margaret whispered. Laura blinked awake and laughed weakly. "I feel like both." Margaret helped tidy up and then sat beside her, watching the boys in wonder. "They have your lips," she said softly. Laura glanced at them, a gentle smile forming. "And his eyes," Margaret raised a brow. "His?" Laura shook her head. "Let's not talk about that part today." She didn't want to name Curtis yet. These months were for bonding, not bitterness. But the truth of who they resembled hung in the air like a portrait no one dared to touch. It was a quiet Saturday when Margaret returned unannounced, carrying a tray of soup and freshly baked bread. Laura opened the door, her hair tied up in a messy bun, wearing a milk-stained shirt and looking utterly exhausted. "I figured you wouldn't have cooked," Margaret said, stepping inside. Laura smiled gratefully. "You're right, I barely remember eating." As Margaret walked into the nursery to set the food down, her breath caught. The triplets were asleep in separate bassinets, the morning light pouring over them like a spotlight. She stepped closer and froze. "Laura," she whispered. They look like," Laura turned slowly, her eyes locking with Margaret's. "Yes," she said calmly, "they're Curtis." Margaret dropped into the nursery chair, stunned. "You told me nothing about this." Laura walked over, kneeling beside her. "I couldn't. Not until I knew they were safe. I used the sample we stored years ago. I signed all the rights over to myself after the divorce. It's all legal, Margaret." Margaret shook her head in disbelief. "Does he know?" "No," Laura replied, firm. "And I don't want him to, not unless life forces it." Margaret glanced again at the boys, the truth soaking in like spilled wine on white linen. "They're going to grow up looking like him," she said quietly. "Won't that hurt?" Laura took a long breath. "It might. But I'll never let their resemblance become a punishment. They're not him. They're better. They're mine." And as the 3 infants slept peacefully, their tiny chests rising and falling in sync, Margaret knew Laura wasn't running from the past anymore. She was raising its transformation. Rodney stood by Laura's kitchen island, watching as she mixed formula with one hand and rocked a sleepy Julian with the other. The boys had just turned 3 months old, and their growth was rapid, just like the quiet attention Laura had begun to draw from neighbors and clients again. Rodney cleared his throat. "I've been thinking. You need to be protected, not just legally, but personally, in case Curtis ever resurfaces." Laura frowned. "I told you I'm not reaching out to him." Rodney nodded. "I know, but you still used his genetic material. What if one day someone makes the connection? Or he comes sniffing around? I just want you to be covered." He pulled out a leather folder from his briefcase and opened it on the table. Inside were notarized documents, IVF timelines, Curtis's original consent, and birth registrations with Laura as the sole parent. It was a shield in paper form. "Everything's airtight," Rodney assured, "but it's smart to keep it close." Laura looked at the folder, then up at Rodney. "You've thought of everything," she said softly. "It's my job," he replied, "but it's also because I care." He paused, searching her expression. "You're raising 3 boys alone, Laura. But more than that, you're raising them under the shadow of a man who doesn't even know he left a legacy behind." She ran her fingers across the edge of the file. If the day ever comes when he finds out. Rodney interrupted gently. You don't owe him anything. Not an explanation, not forgiveness, not even their names. Laura nodded, feeling the weight of those words settle into her spine. As the boys cried out from the nursery, she stood. Let's just hope that day never comes. But as she walked away, file in hand, a quiet voice inside whispered that the past always circles back, especially when you've buried it too well. Carol sat in the back seat of Curtis's luxury SUV, her arms crossed as she stared out the tinted window. They had just left a baby shower for one of Curtis' colleagues, and she hadn't smiled once. You didn't even touch the cake, Curtis said, half joking. Or speak to anyone, for that matter. Carol turned to him sharply. Why would I? Everyone there was either pregnant, holding a baby, or talking about baby names. You think I enjoy watching people celebrate what I've been trying to give you for over a year? Curtis sighed. It's not a competition, Carol. She laughed bitterly. Maybe not to you, but to me, it's a race. And right now, I'm losing. Her words hung in the air like smoke. They'd been trying to conceive for nearly a year, with no results and rising tension. But lately, Curtis had grown distant, and Carol could feel it every time she reached for him and got nothing back. Back at their condo, Carol opened her fertility tracker app and scrolled in frustration. The doctor said I'm fine, so it's not me, she muttered. Curtis sat across the room, barely listening. Maybe we're both just stressed, he replied without looking up from his phone. It's not always about blame. But Carol wasn't hearing it. You know what I think, she snapped. I think your past is cursing your present. Maybe you left something undone with Laura, and now the universe is paying us both back. Curtis finally looked up, startled. Don't bring her into this. Carol crossed her arms. Then stop acting like she doesn't still live in your head. He didn't respond, but his silence confirmed more than words could. Carol stood, heart-pounding. I've given you everything. And yet it feels like I'm still competing with someone who doesn't even want you anymore. The room fell quiet. Whatever held them together was beginning to fray, and the ghosts of decisions past were no longer staying silent. Laura's garage-turned-workshop smelled like fresh pine and fabric glue. With the boys napping inside and the baby monitor clipped to her waistband, she traced fabric over a design board, pins clamped between her teeth. She hadn't planned on returning to work so soon, but when a former client messaged her out of the blue asking for help redesigning a home office, something in her woke up. She took the job, then another. Word spread quickly. Within 2 months, she was juggling 6 clients. Her living room had become a gallery of mood boards and fabric swatches. At night, after she bathed the boys, she'd spend hours sketching in silence, the hum of the monitor blending into her process. Each new project brought income, but more than that, it brought dignity. She was rebuilding more than a business. She was rebuilding herself. Margaret popped in one afternoon and was shocked to find Laura sanding a miniature coffee table while Caleb sat in a carrier on her chest. I leave you for a week and come back to find you running a design empire in pajamas? She teased. Laura laughed. It keeps me sane. And it reminds me who I was before I became just someone's wife. Margaret looked around at the swatches and hand-drawn layouts pinned to the walls. This is more than rediscovery, Laura. It's reinvention. Laura smiled as she wiped her dusty hands on her apron. I used to think I had to choose between motherhood and ambition. Turns out, I can still build while nurturing what I birthed. Margaret walked over to the desk and picked up a mock design labeled Executive Lounge Jet Edition. She raised a brow. What's this? Laura grinned. A proposal for a high-end aviation firm. If I land it, we won't be meeting in this garage again. And as the boys began to stir from their nap, Laura stood taller, messy, tired, but undeniably rising. Curtis sat in the boardroom, surrounded by murmurs and shifting glances as his assistant whispered something urgent into his ear. His presentation, the one he had been preparing for weeks, had just been undercut by an unexpected investor withdrawal. The numbers no longer held. The projections fell apart. As he fumbled through the final slides, trying to hold the room's attention, he could feel it. The subtle shift in energy, the beginning of doubt. After the meeting, he stayed behind alone, staring at the empty chairs. The calls he used to receive from partners had grown fewer. And now, for the first time in years, someone suggested bringing in a creative consultant to refresh leadership. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a warning. Curtis clenched his fists under the table. "I built this damn company," he muttered. But the room didn't answer back. At home that night, he didn't speak much. Carol filled the silence, rambling about a new pilot studio and their dwindling date nights. When she mentioned they should consider rebranding their image as a couple, Curtis snapped. "We're not a product, Carol. You don't get to pitch us like we're a startup." She stared at him, caught off guard. "You're angry because you're losing control," she said, arms folded. "And instead of fixing it, you're taking it out on me." He walked away, unable to deny it. Something was cracking beneath his polished exterior. The praise that once followed him effortlessly had become performative. In the quiet of the night, Curtis scrolled through his old accolades online, but all he felt was emptiness. He didn't realize then, but the life he had walked into with confidence was slowly being eclipsed by the life he'd abandoned without thought. Laura adjusted the strap of her dress blazer as she stepped into the marble-floored lobby of Maxwell Aeronautics, the private aviation design firm known for its selective clientele. She had been invited, unexpectedly, after one of her previous clients shared her name with the CEO. "He's looking for something less formulaic," the client had said. "Your touch is intuitive. He'll notice." Laura had debated whether to even attend the meeting, but something in her gut said go. As she entered the executive suite, the CEO, a broad-shouldered, silver-haired man named Victor Maxwell, stood and extended his hand. "So you're the woman behind the Lagos residence redesign," he said. "They haven't stopped talking about you." Laura smiled modestly. "I just translate what people feel into what they live in." His eyes lit up. "I need someone to do that, except this time for the air." Victor leaned forward, placing a sketch of an unfinished jet interior on the table. "I've seen portfolios that dazzle, but I want soul. I'm not just transporting bodies, I'm hosting decisions, reconciliations, dreams. Can you give me that?" Laura studied the sketch, her fingers dancing across the edges. "Yes, but I'll need a full sensory profile of the owner. Colors, scents, music, how they move when no one's watching." Victor laughed. "Finally, someone who speaks like an artist." The meeting stretched 2 hours longer than scheduled. As she walked out, she carried more than a contract. She carried a validation she never asked for, but deeply needed. In the parking lot, she opened her car door and sat in silence for a moment, her hands shaking slightly. "We're not just surviving anymore, boys," she whispered to the empty back seat. "We're flying." The warehouse was cold but bright, the skeletal frame of the private jet suspended like a blank canvas. Laura walked its length with a team of engineers and stylists, clipboard in hand, ideas brimming. "We're not doing just leather and chrome," she instructed. "The client wants conversation zones, not just cold elegance." The team nodded, taking notes. A few raised eyebrows met her unconventional sketches, but Victor backed her with unwavering confidence. "Let her lead. That's why we brought her in." Laura's design vision included soft-angled dividers, color-adjusting lights, and velvet-paneled walls that responded subtly to temperature shifts, creating emotional atmosphere, not just luxury. For the first time, her imagination wasn't confined by budget, space, or someone else's opinion. Later that week, Victor invited her to a private luncheon. "You know," he began, cutting into his grilled salmon, "if this goes as well as I think it will, you'll have a seat on our advisory board." Laura blinked. "I thought this was just a contract job." Victor smiled. "It was, but you're designing more than planes. You're shaping stories at 30,000 feet. Laura sat back, stunned. When she returned home, the triplets were just waking from their naps, their laughter echoing through the house like sunlight. She gathered them into her arms, one by one, heart swelling. Her life used to feel like it was made up of corners, corners of rooms, corners of dreams, corners she was pushed into. But now it was wide, expansive. And for the first time in years, Laura felt like she wasn't just catching up to her future, she was outpacing it. At nearly 3 years old, Julian, Caleb, and Miles had begun to show more than just individuality. They were revealing legacies. Julian had Curtis's exact smirk when he concentrated, and he asked endless questions about how things worked. Caleb had a brooding calm, always analyzing, watching. His silence spoke volumes. Miles, ever the most affectionate, had the same crooked left dimple Curtis did when he laughed. Laura saw the signs but didn't speak them aloud. Not even to Margaret. Instead, she watched quietly, often frozen in awe and unease. Their resemblance to Curtis had sharpened, and some days it rattled her. But on most days it gave her strength. They were proof that something beautiful could still rise from what had once devastated her. One afternoon, while dressing them for daycare, Caleb pointed at a framed photo Laura had accidentally left on her nightstand, an old portrait of her and Curtis taken during better years. "Who's that?" he asked, pointing to Curtis. Laura froze for a second, zipping up Julian's jacket with deliberate slowness. "That was someone I used to know," she answered softly. "Is he our daddy?" Caleb followed, tilting his head. Laura sat on the edge of the bed, suddenly unable to move. "He helped bring you here," she replied. "But no, he's not your daddy, not the way you think." There was no bitterness in her tone, just truth. Caleb seemed to accept the answer and moved on, humming as he joined his brothers by the door. But Laura sat still for a moment longer, realizing that even the most carefully buried histories had a way of surfacing, especially when those histories were staring back at you with eyes just like his. The gala hall buzzed with soft music and scattered conversations as parents filtered in, dressed in semi-formal wear. Laura arrived holding the hands of two boys, while the third clung playfully to the hem of her flowing jumpsuit. Teachers greeted her warmly. The boys had quickly become favorites, not just for their charm, but their uncanny ability to complete each other's sentences and finish puzzles with uncanny speed. As Laura guided them to their seats for the opening performance, the headmistress approached with a smile. "You must be proud," she said warmly, glancing at the boys. "They're brilliant, and they look so much like their father." Laura's breath caught, but she smiled politely. "Yes, they do take after someone," she replied, careful not to add more. Later that evening, as the boys danced among their classmates, Laura stood by the refreshment table, sipping from a paper cup. A woman in pearls leaned over and whispered, "You must get stopped everywhere with those three. They're the spitting image of someone I know. That strong Bennett jawline, unmistakable." Laura stiffened. "They get that a lot," she said, voice steady. The woman nodded absently and moved on. Laura watched her sons with renewed focus. The more they grew, the more visible the truth became, not just in their faces, but in their posture, their laughter, their energy. That night, once home, Laura placed all three in bed and stood in their shared room for a long time, staring at their sleeping forms. She traced a finger along Caleb's cheek. "You are no one's shadow," she whispered. "You're my morning, and I'll always rise for you." Curtis tossed his tablet onto the couch as he loosened his tie and poured himself a drink. He scrolled through the business column of a lifestyle magazine when a familiar name snagged his attention. Laura Bennett, from housewife to high-flying visionary. His brows furrowed as he clicked the headline. A glossy photo loaded. Laura standing beneath the nose of a custom-designed jet, clipboard in hand, with three identical boys gathered around her legs. The caption read, "Her sons, her drive, her rebirth." Curtis sat down slowly, the article's content blurring in and out of focus as he read phrases like interior genius, emerging design mogul, and redefines elegance at altitude. But it was the boys who haunted him. All three had his nose, his brow line, and most unsettlingly, his smile. He read the article twice more, zooming in on the image. Carol entered the living room, heels clicking, phone in hand. "You ready for the dinner meeting?" she asked. Curtis didn't answer. She stepped closer and saw the photo on the tablet. "Why are you looking at her?" she snapped. "Is this what you've been distracted about lately?" Curtis didn't reply immediately. He simply stared at the screen, whispering to himself, "Those kids. They can't be." Carol's eyes widened. "You think they're yours?" He looked up, finally speaking with quiet alarm. "I don't think. I know." Carol grabbed the tablet, read through the article, and then flung it onto the couch. "She wouldn't do that without telling you. She's not that bold." Curtis stood, his heart pounding. "You don't know her like I do. When she loves, she gives. But when she's hurt, she builds without looking back." And for the first time since he left her, Curtis felt truly shaken, not by regret, but by the revelation that maybe he hadn't left her behind at all. Maybe he'd only freed her. Carol stormed into their living room like a thundercloud, her stiletto heels discarded by the door as she paced barefoot across the tile. "You've been quiet all week, Curtis. Barely sleeping. And now you're watching her on TV interviews like she's a movie star." Curtis didn't respond. His eyes were glued to the television where Laura's design segment was being re-aired, the camera panning to the triplets beside her. "I saw you zoom in on those kids," Carol spat, her voice sharp. "You think she used your sperm, don't you?" Curtis finally looked at her. "She didn't have to tell me. I can see it. Every line in their faces, it's me." Carol's lip curled. "So what? You're going to show up there, knock on her door, and say what? Hey, I walked out on you, but now I want to play daddy to 3 children I never knew existed?" Her voice cracked on the last word, and beneath her anger was panic, the fragile kind bred from fear of losing a man who was never truly hers. Curtis stood, rubbing his temples. "I need to know. I deserve to know." Carol stepped in front of him, blocking his path. "Deserve?" She laughed bitterly. "You left her. You said she was barren. You called her a dead end." Her voice dropped. "You don't deserve anything except to live with the choice you made." For a long moment, Curtis just stared at her, the fury in his eyes dimming into something dangerously quiet. "Maybe you're right," he said, "but I also know what it feels like to be erased. And that I can't sit with." Carol's composure cracked further as she whispered, "You're choosing her, after everything." Curtis didn't answer. He didn't need to. His silence was louder than any confession. As he walked past her and closed the door gently behind him, Carol sank to the floor, shaking. She hadn't just lost the fight. She had never stood a chance against the kind of love that grows in silence and reemerges with a face that mirrored the past. The day was golden and dry when Curtis stepped out of the black SUV at the private hangar Laura had designed. His suit was tailored, his shoes polished, but nothing in his appearance could hide the anxiety lodged in his chest. A staff member recognized him and motioned toward the back, where the jet Laura had built was being prepped for an upcoming photo shoot. Curtis walked slowly, his breath catching when he spotted her. She stood near the aircraft, clipboard in hand, giving calm instructions to a small crew. Her jumpsuit was utility-styled but elegant, her hair wrapped in a clean bun. She was everything he didn't expect her to be, poised, commanding, unbothered. He approached with a smirk he didn't quite believe in. "So, this is what you've been up to," he said, voice laced with faux amusement. Laura turned, her eyes freezing the moment she saw him. "Curtis." Just one word, level and distant. "You look different," he added, scanning her. "Success suits you." She crossed her arms. "Why are you here?" There was no warmth in her tone, only exhaustion barely concealed. "I saw the article," he began. "I saw them. The boys." Laura stiffened but didn't look away. "You shouldn't have come." Curtis stepped closer. "Laura, those children are mine," she said, cutting him off. "Legally, biologically, emotionally. You were never a part of this." He swallowed hard. "You used the sample?" She didn't blink. "I did. You signed the rights away. You said you were done." Curtis ran a hand over his face. "I didn't know it would feel like this. Seeing them." Laura tilted her head, calm but firm. "Now you do. And that's all you're entitled to knowing. Nothing else." The words were steel. And Curtis realized the woman before him was not the one he left. She was something stronger, something untouchable. The sun glinted off the polished wing of the jet as Laura gathered her things after the shoot. She spotted her sons running toward her from the lounge, their voices high with excitement. "Mommy, can we go in the plane again?" Julian shouted, his face lit up. Laura opened her arms and embraced them all at once, kissing their foreheads. Then, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed Curtis still standing by the hangar wall, frozen as he watched. The boys turned toward him curiously. "Who's that?" Miles asked. Laura stood up straight. "No one you need to know," she answered gently. But Curtis stepped forward. "I'm not no one," he said. "You're late," Laura interjected calmly, then turned to the boys. "Say goodbye to the hangar. It's time to go." The triplets waved at the plane, unaware of the tension in the air. Curtis tried again. "Don't they deserve the truth?" Laura looked at him, her face unreadable. They have the only truth that matters, that they are loved, that they were wanted. Curtis's voice broke. Do they know about me? Laura hesitated, then crouched beside the boys. Come on, my darlings, she said. Time to board. As they walked past him hand in hand, Caleb looked back briefly and stared at Curtis. Curtis smiled gently. Caleb didn't smile back. He simply turned forward and held tighter to Laura's hand. Curtis watched as they ascended the small steps into the aircraft, 3 perfect reflections of a past he had forfeited and a future he would never shape. For the first time in his life, he understood what it meant to lose something he could never reclaim. Curtis stood beneath the aircraft's stairwell, stunned as the jet doors closed behind Laura and the boys. The hum of the engines hadn't even begun, yet the moment felt loud, final. He remained frozen, his hands clenched at his sides, until a firm voice behind him broke the silence. Mr. Bennett? Curtis turned sharply to see Rodney Blake approaching in a dark suit, a briefcase in hand. You've stirred up enough with your surprise visit. But since you clearly won't leave this alone, I was instructed to give you this. Rodney handed him a sealed manila envelope. What's this? Curtis asked. Answers, Rodney replied. The kind you think you're entitled to. But be very clear, what's in there doesn't change anything for her. Curtis took it slowly, the weight of the envelope somehow heavier than paper. He ripped the seal open as Rodney stepped back, watching like a lawyer who'd seen this moment coming for years. Inside were legal forms, dated records from the fertility clinic, a scanned copy of Curtis's signed release, and birth certificates for each of the boys, everyone listing mother, Laura Bennett. Father, not declared. Curtis's throat dried. Among the documents was a typed IVF timeline detailing the procedure's exact date, 48 hours after divorce finalization. His own signature stared back at him, authorizing full genetic rights to Laura. She planned this, he whispered, more to himself than anyone. Rodney's face remained unreadable. She chose this. After you walked away, she still found purpose. That shouldn't make you angry. It should make you reflective. Curtis looked up, eyes flickering with something that wasn't quite regret, but not far from it either. And what about me? He asked. What do I do now? Rodney adjusted his cufflinks. You walk away, same as before. Only this time, you leave without assuming the story ends with you. Curtis drove home in silence, the documents resting beside him like an indictment. Every red light felt longer, every turn heavier. Once inside his condo, he tossed the folder on the table and collapsed onto the couch, rubbing his temples. Carol emerged from the bedroom, wearing a robe and suspicion. Did you find what you were looking for? She asked coolly. More than I expected, he muttered. She picked up the envelope and flipped through it. Her expression hardened. So it's true. Curtis nodded slowly. All of it. Every detail. I gave her the tools, and she used them. And now she's built a life I'll never be part of. He sounded lost. Carol dropped the envelope with a loud sigh. Then maybe you should stop chasing ghosts and deal with the woman who's still here. Her voice was sharp, but her eyes were damp with disappointment. Curtis stood facing her. You're not here, he said bluntly. You've been beside me, yes, but never with me. You've always been in competition with a version of Laura that no longer exists. Carol blinked. You really think this is about her? He sighed. It's not. It's about me. And everything I ignored until it was too late. She stared at him, realization dawning. Then you've already made your decision. Curtis didn't argue. He walked past her to the balcony where the city glowed in silence. Inside, the envelope remained open on the table, its contents loud enough to end everything. And as Carol packed her things quietly in the background, Curtis remained still, holding the railing like a man who had seen the future and had no place in it. The next time Laura saw Curtis was completely unplanned. She had returned to the hangar for a final inspection before the jet's delivery when she spotted him leaning against the wall by the lounge entrance. She didn't flinch, didn't slow, just kept walking with quiet purpose until he stepped directly into her path. I read everything, he said, holding up the folder she already knew he had. And I came to say something. She glanced at the papers in his hand. They don't grant you a role. Don't confuse information with invitation. Curtis lowered his voice. I never thought you'd actually go through with it. That you'd Finish what I gave up on. Laura's eyes stayed locked on his. That's because you underestimated the power of a woman who no longer needs your approval. Curtis took a breath. I didn't come here to beg. I just needed to see you, and them. Laura stepped closer, her expression unreadable. You saw them. You know the truth. But here's what you missed. I never did this to spite you. I did this to save myself. She leaned in slightly, her voice quieter but firm. You left thinking I was empty, but I was full of dreams too big for your vision. Curtis looked down. They're incredible boys. They are, she said proudly. And they will never need to feel abandoned because I never let go. She turned to leave, but paused, just long enough to say one last thing without looking back. I didn't need you. They did, and they still became whole without you. And she walked away, unshaken, unburdened, and completely free. The apartment felt colder than usual as Carol stood in the living room, suitcase open on the floor beside her. She folded her clothes methodically, not out of calm, but from the kind of numbness that comes after too many quiet fights and unanswered questions. Curtis leaned against the doorframe, watching her silently. You're really leaving, he said, not as a question, but a tired observation. Carol didn't look up. You left long before I did, Curtis. You just stayed in the house. He swallowed hard, his throat tight with a guilt he couldn't rationalize away. You deserved more from me. I just didn't know how to give it. She paused, glancing at him with red-rimmed eyes. No, you didn't want to give it, because part of you always stayed with her, even after she stopped waiting for you. She zipped her bag and stood, facing him one last time. Let me tell you what really hurts, she said, voice trembling. It's not that she has your children. It's not that she built something without you. It's that she never chased you. She didn't post pictures, didn't send letters, didn't scream for you to see her worth. And still, she won. Curtis didn't try to defend himself. He simply nodded, defeated. Carol took one last look around the room, then walked past him toward the elevator. As the doors closed, she offered one final sentence. She didn't steal anything. You handed it to her, and she turned it into gold. Alone now, Curtis moved to the window and watched the city below, teeming with lives that didn't need his approval to flourish. He thought of the boys, their eyes, their laughter, and the woman who had become more than he ever imagined. And in that moment, he finally understood he was not the loss. She had been the gain all along. Inside the private jet, Laura sat in the plush leather seat by the window as clouds rolled beneath her like waves. Julian lay with his head on her lap. Caleb sketched in a small notebook across from her, and Miles quietly nibbled on crackers while humming. The cabin was warm, peaceful, filled with a rare quiet only found when all is as it should be. Rodney sat near the back, reviewing design contracts on his tablet, occasionally glancing at the boys with a faint smile. Laura rested her hand gently on Julian's curls and exhaled deeply. She wasn't escaping anymore. She wasn't hiding. This was simply life, a life she had fought for, sacrificed for, and earned with a strength even she once doubted she had. The noise of the past, the sting of rejection, the ache of loneliness, none of it had followed her here. As the pilot announced their descent, the boys stirred, excited to land in the city where Laura's next project awaited. Mommy, do you think our room will have stars on the ceiling again? Caleb asked, his eyes wide. Laura smiled. If you want stars, we'll hang galaxies. The boys laughed, their voices echoing through the cabin. Rodney leaned forward and said, You know, people will talk when they see you step out of this jet. Laura chuckled softly. Let them. I've lived enough in silence. Let them see. As the wheels touched the runway, Laura looked out at the glowing skyline, then down at her sons, her future. This jet doesn't make us important, she whispered. But it carried us from broken to becoming. That's all that matters. And as the stairs descended and the doors opened to a world that once forgot her, Laura stood tall, with 3 beautiful boys, a fulfilled heart, and the kind of victory no one could take back. Here's the Bible verse, Isaiah 61, verse 3. To bestow on them a crown of beauty instead of ashes, the oil of joy instead of mourning, and a garment of praise instead of a spirit of despair. They will be called oaks of righteousness, a planting of the Lord for the display of his splendor. Why this verse? This scripture captures Laura's transformation. from abandonment and grief to wholeness and purpose. Her ashes were exchanged for a crown of beauty. She became a symbol of quiet strength, not just surviving, but flourishing as a testament of grace and inner power. Moral of the story: sometimes what breaks you is not the end of you. It's the beginning of who you were always meant to become. Laura's story reminds us that rejection doesn't define worth, and silence isn't weakness. It can be the soil where resilience takes root. Love that leaves doesn't cancel love that grows. And the most powerful victories are often the ones no one sees coming until you board the jet they said you'd never fly. That's the end of the story. What did you learn from this story? Drop your thoughts in the comments section. Leave a like and don't forget to subscribe and turn on post notification so that you'll be notified whenever we drop our next videos. Also, share this video to someone who might be interested. Thank you so much